When I stepped out of Eric's car that night, I didn't notice my husband standing on the porch right away. The cool night air hit me first, sobering me just enough to remind me that I'd had one too many glasses of wine at the company party. Eric, ever the gentleman, had insisted on driving me home after I fumbled with my phone, unable to order a ride. I thanked him as I closed the door, swaying slightly on my heels, and turned toward the house. That's when I saw Chris. He was standing in the dim porch light, arms crossed, his face shadowed but his expression unmistakable. Anger, betrayal, suspicion, all etched into the hard line of his jaw. My stomach dropped. "It's not what it looks like," I blurted out, though I knew how hollow the words sounded. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me like he was waiting for me to dig my own grave. I stumbled up the steps, my heart pounding. "I drank too much," I tried to explain. "Eric was just being nice. He gave me a ride home." "Nice," Chris repeated, his voice cold. "That's what you call it?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. The weight of his accusation hung in the air between us, unspoken but deafening. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, the foundation of everything we'd built together starting to crack. That moment was the beginning of the end. I didn't know it then, but it was the spark that would ignite everything. My marriage, my career, my reputation. All of it would burn because of one ride home, one mistake, and everything that came after. Looking back now, I can see all the cracks that had been there long before that night. My marriage to Chris wasn't falling apart because of one misunderstanding or even one bad decision. It had been unraveling for years, slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just the usual things: work stress, missed date nights, arguments about the small stuff. But over time, those little things built into a wall, and neither of us had the energy or desire to break it down. Chris and I met in our mid-20s. He was charming and ambitious, with a knack for making me laugh, even when I was having the worst day. He worked in construction management, a field that suited his hands-on nature and straightforward personality. I was in marketing, just starting out at a small agency where I'd been working long hours trying to climb the ladder. We clicked instantly, and for a while it felt like we were unstoppable. We had the kind of passion that made other people envious. He was my rock, and I was his biggest cheerleader. But life has a way of grinding down even the strongest relationships. As Chris's career took off, so did mine. We bought a house in the suburbs, settled into routines, and somewhere along the way that spark we had started to dim. He began working longer hours, coming home late and exhausted. I threw myself into my work as a way to fill the void, climbing the corporate ladder until I landed a comfortable position as a marketing manager at a tech company. On paper, we had everything: a nice house, good jobs, a stable life. But beneath the surface, there was distance, silence, and the unspoken knowledge that neither of us was truly happy. It didn't help that my job placed me in the orbit of people like Eric. He was my boss, a charismatic, sharp-dressed man in his 50s who had an uncanny ability to command attention. Eric was the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone hanging on his every word within minutes. He was confident, charming, and just flirtatious enough to make you feel special without crossing any lines, at least not publicly. From the moment I started working under him, I could tell he had a soft spot for me. He praised my ideas in meetings, gave me high-profile projects, and always made a point to check in on me, even when it wasn't necessary. At first, I saw it as mentorship. I told myself he saw potential in me, that he wanted to help me succeed. And maybe that was true in the beginning. But as the months went on, his attention started to feel more personal. He complimented my outfits, lingered a little too long during conversations, and found excuses to call me into his office for quick chats that had nothing to do with work. I tried to brush it off, laughing awkwardly at his comments or steering the conversation back to business. I told myself it was harmless. Chris, on the other hand, wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He met Eric once, briefly, at a company event last year, and afterward, he made a comment that stuck with me. "That guy's too smooth for his own good," he said. I laughed it off, but I could tell Chris didn't like him. Over the months, he'd occasionally ask questions about Eric. Innocuous ones, like whether I was still working on that big project with him, or if he was attending the next company meeting. But there was always an edge to his tone, a subtle hint of suspicion that I tried to ignore. The night of the company party? I wasn't thinking about any of that. It was one of the biggest events of the year, held at a swanky downtown hotel with an open bar, a live band, and enough food to feed a small army. I spent the day obsessing over what to wear, finally settling on a black cocktail dress that was a little more daring than my usual style. Chris wasn't thrilled about me going without him, but he never enjoyed work events, so I didn't push it. The party was everything I expected. Loud, glamorous, and just the right amount of over the top. I spent the first hour chatting with coworkers and sipping champagne, trying to navigate the fine line between enjoying myself and maintaining a professional image. Eric found me not long after I arrived, complimenting my dress in a way that made me blush despite myself. "You always know how to make an impression," he said, his eyes lingering just a second too long. As the night went on, I found myself drawn into Eric's orbit. He had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, his attention laser-focused and flattering. He poured me another drink, then another, and before I knew it, I was leaning against the bar, laughing at one of his stories. I told myself it was innocent, that I was just enjoying the party, but there was a small voice in the back of my mind warning me to be careful. By the time I realized how much I'd had to drink, it was too late. My head was spinning, and I could barely stand without wobbling. I reached for my phone to order a ride, but my fingers felt clumsy, and I struggled to navigate the app. Eric noticed immediately. "Let me drive you home," he offered, his voice calm and reassuring. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to say no, but the thought of trying to find another way home in my state felt overwhelming. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Of course," he said, placing a steady hand on my arm. "I'll make sure you get home safe." I told myself it was fine, that it was just a ride, but the moment I stepped into his car, I felt a pang of guilt. The drive was uneventful, mostly quiet aside from Eric asking if I was feeling okay. When we pulled up to my house, I thanked him and reached for the door handle, eager to put the whole night behind me. And that's when I saw Chris standing on the porch. Chris didn't move from his spot on the porch as I walked toward him, my heels clicking softly against the pavement in the stillness of the night. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from alcohol this time, but from the way his eyes bore into me. He didn't say a word until I reached the steps, where I hesitated, unsure of how to start. "Do you want to explain why your boss is dropping you off at this hour?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. I opened my mouth, fumbling for the right words. "I had too much to drink at the party," I said quickly. "I couldn't drive, and I couldn't figure out the rideshare app. Eric offered to give me a ride, that's all." His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "That's all?" "Yes," I insisted, taking a step closer. "Chris, you know me. Nothing happened. He was just being nice." "Nice?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Since when does your boss care enough to chauffeur you home? Or is this just the first time I'm seeing it?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "You're being ridiculous. It's not like that. I can't control how he acts, but I didn't do anything wrong." Chris let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Sure. And I'm just supposed to believe that, am I? You think I haven't noticed the way he looks at you? Or how much time you spend together at work?" I froze, the air between us crackling with tension. "He's my boss, Chris. We work together. Of course, we spend time on projects. That's my job. And the flirting? The compliments? Is that part of the job too?" His words hit like a slap, and I flinched despite myself. "There's nothing going on," I said, my voice trembling. "You're twisting this into something it's not." "Am I?" he shot back, his tone cold. "Because it sure as hell doesn't look like that from where I'm standing." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, a mix of frustration and exhaustion washing over me. "I can't do this right now," I said, brushing past him and heading toward the door. Chris didn't stop me, but when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him standing there, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Inside, I leaned against the door, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that Chris would calm down once we both had some space. But even as I thought it, I could feel the cracks widening between us, the foundation of our marriage trembling under the weight of his accusations. The rest of the night was a blur. I went upstairs, changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was a storm of emotions. Anger at Chris for not trusting me, guilt for accepting Eric's ride, and a deep, sinking fear that this argument was only the beginning. When I finally drifted off, it was to the sound of the guest room door closing downstairs. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Chris was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I said tentatively, hoping to break the ice. "Morning," he replied curtly, his eyes never leaving the screen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us stretching uncomfortably. I wanted to say something, to apologize or explain further, but I didn't know how to start. Chris wasn't the type to let things go easily, and I could feel the weight of his suspicion hanging over us like a dark cloud. The uneasy truce lasted until later that evening, when I came out of the shower to find Chris standing in the bedroom, holding my phone. My heart sank as I saw the look on his face, cold, accusing, and furious. "What are you doing with my phone?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Funny thing," he said, holding it up. "You left it on the counter unlocked, so I decided to take a look. Guess what I found?" My stomach twisted into knots. "Chris, give me my phone." He ignored me, his eyes narrowing as he scrolled through the screen. "Let's see. Here's a text from Eric, looking stunning tonight. And this one, let me know when you get home safe." He looked up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just your boss being nice, right?" "Chris, stop," I said, stepping closer and reaching for the phone. But he pulled it back, his grip tightening. "Did you ever think to tell him to stop?" he demanded. "Or were you enjoying the attention too much?" "I didn't encourage him," I said, my voice trembling. "I was going to talk to him about it, but—" "But what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You were too busy letting him drive you home, letting him flirt with you? What the hell, Lena?" I felt tears streaming down my face, frustration and guilt bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said, though the words felt hollow even to me. Chris let out a bitter laugh, tossing the phone onto the bed. "Sure. Keep telling yourself that." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my hands shaking. I picked up my phone, staring at the messages he'd found. They weren't explicit, but they weren't innocent either. Eric's compliments, his playful tone, it was all there, laid out in black and white. I wanted to scream, to cry, to undo everything that had led to this moment. But it was too late. The damage was done. Chris barely spoke to me over the next few days. He wasn't outright hostile, but there was a coldness in his demeanor that I couldn't ignore. He went through the motions, going to work, coming home, sitting on the couch with his laptop, but it was clear he was keeping me at arm's length. I tried to talk to him once, late one night after we'd both gone to bed. I turned to him in the dark, reaching for his hand. "Chris, I love you," I said quietly. "Please, can we just talk about this?" He pulled his hand away, his voice flat. "I'm tired, Lena. We'll talk later." But later never came. The days after the fight with Chris blurred into a strange routine of silence and avoidance. He wasn't outright cruel, but the way he moved through the house, cold and distant, made it clear he didn't trust me. I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, hoping the tension would fade with time, but it didn't. The weight of his suspicion sat heavy on my shoulders, following me even when I left the house. At work, things weren't much better. I found myself hyper-aware of Eric's every word and gesture, as if Chris's accusations had made me see him through a different lens. I started to notice how often he stopped by my desk, how his compliments always seemed just a little too personal. I told myself it was nothing, that it had always been like this, and I was only overthinking because of what Chris said. But the truth was harder to ignore when Eric leaned against the edge of my desk one afternoon, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. "You look tired," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I forced a smile, glancing back at my computer screen. "Just a lot on my mind." "Anything I can help with?" he asked, his tone almost playful. I shook my head, not trusting myself to say more. The conversation was innocent on the surface, but the way he looked at me made my stomach flutter with a mix of unease and something I didn't want to admit. Later that week, Eric called me into his office to review a campaign we'd been working on. The meeting started off normal enough, graphs, projections, the usual back and forth about strategy. But as the conversation shifted, so did his tone. "You've been distracted lately," he said, leaning back in his chair. I looked down at the folder in my lap, avoiding his gaze. "Just some personal stuff," I said vaguely. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, his voice softening. The question caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. "Chris thinks I'm having an affair." Eric raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "With who?" I hesitated, my face flushing. "With you." For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I immediately regretted bringing it up. But then he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous," he said. "We're coworkers, friends even. Nothing more." His reassurance should have made me feel better, but the way he said it, the casual way he dismissed the idea, left me feeling oddly deflated. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't have said anything." "Hey," he said, his tone softening again. "It's fine. Really. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." I nodded, mumbling a quick thanks before leaving his office. But as I walked back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension between Chris and me only grew worse. He still barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and clipped, like he was holding back something he wanted to say. One evening, I stayed late at work to finish up a project. Most of the office had cleared out by then, leaving the building quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I was so focused on my screen that I didn't notice Eric standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked, stepping into the room. "Something like that," I said, leaning back in my chair and rubbing my temples. He walked over to my desk, glancing at the spreadsheet on my screen. "You work too hard, Lena," he said, his voice low and familiar. "You deserve a break." I let out a small laugh, more out of nervousness than anything else. "Tell that to my deadlines." Eric didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned against the edge of my desk, his gaze steady. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his tone shifting. "You're one of the most talented people I've worked with, and yet, I feel like you don't hear that enough." "Eric," I started, but he cut me off. "No, really," he said, his hand brushing against mine as he gestured. "You deserve more than what you're getting, at work, at home, everywhere." The way he said it made my heart race. I looked up at him, my breath catching as I realized how close he was. "Eric, I don't think..." Before I could finish, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. For a moment I froze, caught between shock and the undeniable pull of the moment. But then, against my better judgment, I kissed him back. The kiss deepened, his hands finding my waist as he pulled me closer. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to pull away, but my body wouldn't listen. There was something intoxicating about the way he held me, the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a tidal wave. I stepped back, my breathing unsteady. This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. Eric didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he said finally, though his tone didn't sound apologetic. I shook my head, grabbing my bag and practically running out of the office. My heart was pounding as I got into my car, my mind racing with guilt and confusion. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I avoided Eric as much as possible, throwing myself into work and pretending nothing had changed. But it had. Every time I saw him, I felt a pang of guilt, mixed with an undeniable spark of something I didn't want to name. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. Chris's silence wasn't the passive kind. It wasn't the type of silence where things slowly blew over. It was loud, sharp, and deliberate, as if every unsaid word was a weapon he was carefully choosing before striking. I could feel it every time I walked into a room, every time we exchanged a forced good morning or good night. It was only a matter of time before something gave way, but I had no idea just how calculated he was being. At work, things with Eric had become complicated. After that kiss, I avoided him as much as I could. I wasn't sure what I expected, that he'd pretend it never happened, or that we could go back to our professional dynamic. But Eric wasn't the type to let things slide. When he walked into a room, his eyes would find mine, and I'd feel the weight of everything unspoken between us. He wasn't pushy, but his presence alone was enough to keep me on edge. It wasn't long before he cornered me in his office after a late meeting. Everyone else had gone home, leaving the building dark and quiet. I was packing up my things when he called my name. His tone was soft, almost apologetic, but there was an edge of something else. Determination, maybe. "Can we talk?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Lena," he said, stepping closer. "I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach twisted at his words, a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite name. "This isn't right, Eric," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm married." His lips curved into a faint, almost knowing smile. "Are you, though?" The question hung in the air, sharp and piercing. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. Because deep down, I knew what he meant. Chris and I hadn't been a real couple in years. We were roommates at best, strangers at worst. Eric stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "You deserve to be happy, Lena. You deserve someone who sees you." His words broke something in me. Before I could stop myself, I was kissing him, the weight of my guilt temporarily drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. This time, I didn't pull away. What started as stolen moments in his office quickly escalated. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniably part of it. It was the way Eric made me feel, like I was the center of his world. He listened when I talked, paid attention to the smallest details, and made me feel like I mattered in a way Chris hadn't in years. I told myself it was just a fling, a temporary escape from the mess my life had become. But the more time I spent with Eric, the harder it became to draw the line between what was real and what was just a fantasy. Meanwhile, Chris was watching. I didn't know it at the time, but every move I made was being carefully observed, every late night at the office cataloged and scrutinized. He never confronted me again about Eric, but his questions became more pointed. "How's work?" he'd ask, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You've been spending a lot of time there lately?" I brushed it off, telling myself he was just being paranoid. But the truth was, I underestimated him. Chris wasn't the type to make accusations without proof, and he was determined to get it. One night, after another late meeting with Eric, I came home to find Chris sitting on the couch, his laptop open on his lap. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. "I told you I had a meeting," I replied, kicking off my heels and setting my bag down by the door. "Must have been some meeting," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off and headed upstairs. It wasn't until later that I realized my phone was missing. Panic set in as I searched the bedroom, my purse, the kitchen, anywhere I could think of. Finally, I went back downstairs, where Chris was still sitting on the couch. My stomach dropped when I saw my phone sitting on the coffee table in front of him. "Looking for this?" he asked, picking it up and holding it out. I reached for it, but he pulled it back, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Interesting messages you've got here," he said, his tone casual but laced with venom. My heart stopped. "Chris, give me my phone." "Sure," he said, tossing it onto the couch beside him. "But you might want to explain why your boss is booking hotel rooms under his name and texting you things like, 'Can't wait to see you again.'" I froze, my mind racing as I tried to come up with an explanation. "You went through my phone?" "You left it on the counter," he said with a shrug. "What was I supposed to do? Ignore the notifications from Eric at 11 p.m.? "Chris, it's not what you think," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't insult me," he snapped, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me for weeks, hell, maybe months. And for what? Him?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I tried to find the right words, but nothing I said would have mattered. The damage was done. The next few days were a nightmare. Chris stopped pretending to be civil, instead throwing barbed comments my way whenever we were in the same room. I could feel the anger radiating off him, but he didn't confront me again. At least, not directly. It wasn't until I started noticing the whispers at work that I realized what he'd done. It started small, sideways glances, hushed conversations that stopped when I walked by. But then Angela from HR called me into her office, her expression grim. "We received some concerning emails," she said, sliding a printed copy of a screenshot across the desk. My blood ran cold as I recognized the text between Eric and me, messages I thought were private now laid out in black and white. Chris had sent them to HR. And not just HR, he'd sent them to my coworkers, my friends, anyone who would listen. The fallout was swift and brutal. Eric was called into a disciplinary meeting, and though he tried to shield me from the worst of it, there was only so much he could do. By the end of the week, I was out of a job, my reputation in ruins. At home, things were even worse. Chris made no effort to hide his satisfaction as he watched me pack my things. "You brought this on yourself," he said, his voice cold. I hope he was worth it. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The first night after I left the house, I stayed in a motel on the edge of town, the kind with threadbare carpets and flickering neon signs. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my suitcase half unpacked on the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old building settling into itself. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. I tried calling Eric, but he didn't pick up. It didn't surprise me. His life was in just as much chaos as mine. The scandal Chris unleashed had reached every corner of our professional lives, and while I had been fired, Eric wasn't far behind. His name was splashed across office gossip, his reputation dragged through the mud, and rumors about his personal life ran rampant. For all his confidence and charm, he was just as exposed as I was, and part of me hated myself for dragging him into this. Another part wondered if he ever really cared about me at all, or if I was just another mistake he wished he could undo. Over the next few days, I tried to piece together the wreckage of my life. I stayed with a friend for a while, someone I hadn't seen much in recent years, but who welcomed me with open arms when I called, sobbing, asking for a place to stay. She didn't pry or ask for details, just handed me a cup of tea and told me I could stay as long as I needed. It was a kindness I didn't feel I deserved, but I clung to it like a lifeline. Eric finally called me back a week later. His voice was tired, more strained than I'd ever heard it. "Lena," he said, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears welling up again. "I know," he said, his tone softer. "It's not your fault." But it was, at least partly. We both knew that. He suggested we meet for coffee, and though I hesitated, I agreed. Seeing him again felt strange, almost surreal. He looked the same, well-dressed, composed, but there was a heaviness to him now, a crack in the confident facade he'd always worn so well. We talked for hours, picking apart everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it all. He told me his wife had found out about us through the same emails Chris had sent, and that she'd left him, taking their kids with her. I wanted to feel sympathy, but instead, I just felt empty. I realized then that whatever we'd had, or thought we'd had, was over. There was no saving it, no rebuilding from the ashes. Too much damage had been done, and neither of us had the strength to fight for something that had never really been built to last. When we said goodbye that day, it felt final. Eric hugged me, a gesture that felt more like closure than anything else. "Take care of yourself," he said before walking away, and I knew I'd never see him again. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. Slowly, tentatively, I applied for jobs, sent out resumes, and tried to put the pieces of my life back together. The weight of what I'd done, of everything I'd lost, never left me, but I learned to carry it. I learned to face the whispers, the judgment, the awkward silences from people who knew too much. Chris filed for divorce shortly after I moved out. The process was quick and brutal, like ripping off a bandage. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to negotiate. He just wanted me out of his life, and I couldn't blame him. I signed the papers without a fight, knowing I had no right to ask for anything more. One night, as I sat alone in my tiny new apartment, I found myself scrolling through old photos of Chris and me. Back when we were happy, back when things were simpler. I wondered if I could have done something differently, if there was a moment where I could have turned back and saved us. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we'd been broken long before Eric came into the picture. My mistakes may have been the final blow, but they weren't the only ones to blame. Time moved forward, as it always does. I found a new job at a smaller company where no one knew my name or my story. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a fresh start, a chance to prove to myself that I could move on. I cut ties with everyone from my old life, including Eric. It was painful at first, but eventually it became a relief, like shedding an old skin that no longer fit. The hardest part was forgiving myself. There were nights when the guilt would hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. But slowly, I learned to breathe through it, to remind myself that I wasn't defined by my worst mistakes. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I was determined not to let it ruin the rest of my life. Every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about Chris. I'd wonder if he was happier without me, if he'd found someone new, someone who could give him the things I couldn't. Part of me hoped he had. He deserved it, even if I didn't. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. My life isn't perfect, it's messy and complicated and full of scars. But it's mine, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm living it for myself.